Perfect, thank you. I will attempt to keep my own time as well. So right now it's Rajiv and I that stand between you and lunch. So we'll try to respect that. Couple things. So first of all, thank you to the organizing committee and to Dr. Gorbani for the invite, the opportunity to speak to you, not only to meet some colleagues, but also a wonderful keynote cast. It's great. And I'm excited by the opportunity to meet some of the students at UNB in the MaxSec program tomorrow that we've been supporting the last couple of years. So I look forward to that. A couple things before we get started. I too can attest to Dr. Gorbani's ping pong skills. The one thing that Greg didn't mention is there are Chatham House rules at those events. To attribute very sensitive information to an individual is not supposed to happen. So I do apologize for that, Dr. Gorbani. So my talk about supply chain risk. We'll get into it a little bit later, but the first thing I want to do is maybe level set a little bit on who we are. I think it was Andrew that talked about the diversity of the crowd, the fact that we have people in this audience that are 2000 babies. As I talk about supply chain risk and the evolution we're going through in the technology shift, I was sitting at the table feverishly writing some notes and I started to think about this. Bear with me if you are a 2000 baby. I'm going to pick on you just for a minute, and I hope it's not too painful. But I thought about how you would confuse a 2000s baby in 2022, and I thought about you could put them in a room with, and I wrote down. I took some notes, and this will, I promise it relates. Okay, a rotary phone, a VHS player, a TV with no remote, but the most important part is give them the instructions on how to use them written in cursive. Anyway. Okay, so let's start here. So we've been, these are the kind of obligatory marketing setup, but just a couple of interesting facts, and it does relate. 140 years of communications in this company, Bell Canada has been a part of. And while my colleague at Rogers might debate it or question it, we are Canada's largest communications company. I say this because not only are we the largest, but we are a massive part of the threat landscape in Canada. As you can appreciate, we like to say that we not only connect Canadians, but protect Canadians. So, and because essentially Canada's largest businesses run on Bell. I know that sounds a bit of an egotistical, but it's true if you really think about it. And again, because Greg's not here to defend it or argue it, I'll take the stab at it. I'll build this slide again. This is the obligatory marketing one. We're in a lot of places. And if you live in Canada or have grown up here, there's probably not a brand on that slide that you don't recognize. We're intrinsic in everything. And again, I go back to my comment about the threat landscape. That's what makes my job interesting and challenging because of the diversity of the threats we see. Another kind of interesting point, again, that just kind of demonstrates what we see and do every day is the fact that about 80 to 85% of the nation's traffic actually hits one of our networks. Incredible lens, incredible visibility. Very few companies globally that can actually say that. Some of that has to do with the way we're structured, you know, as a country or as the way our telecom sector is, but it gives us an incredible lens and view into Canadian data and Canadian companies. I'll skip over this. It's not that important. It's just the picture of the family. That's a little bit of my grounding as well, about 2000 babies. I've got 3 kids, and so watching them grow up just makes me chuckle. They don't even realize what challenges look like these days. It's funny. So a little bit of the level set on the threat landscape. So global threats continue to grow. We know that. Those are sometimes related to geopolitical tension, criminal organizations, hacktivists. We heard from Chris this morning talking and sharing some data around some of the criminal organizations. It goes on and on and on, right? Ransomware is changing the insurance landscape. How many in this room are responsible for obtaining your organization's cyber insurance? Just 1, 2. Okay, lonely crowd. Okay. I'll tell you that I'm responsible for that. I won't even call it interviewed. It's a little more intrusive than that by the underwriters. This year, I would say last year, and then this year again, the most challenging I've ever seen. Why? Well, it's difficult to obtain cyber insurance as a large company, largely driven by ransomware, right? Essentially, the payouts that insurers are making exceed the premiums. And if you understand how the insurance market works, that's not a good model when you're paying out more than you're collecting on premiums. And so it's really, really challenging, and they're pushing people to manage their security and harden systems. And I bring that up because all of that is about that personal gain. And obviously the supply chain risk, we're seeing it grow. And I'll park that just for one moment, because I'll make the connection back and the importance of supply chain in a moment. This is audience participation time. I asked one question, I'll ask you another one, since you guys aren't asking a lot. How many in this room, whether it's government, private sector, how many of you know how many times, even a month or a year, your organization is attacked? Put your hand up if you know it. This is the audience participation time. Nobody. Wow, you guys know. Okay, let me ask you a question. For those, keep your hands up. Keep your hands up for a second if you can. Okay, how many of you are attacked 1 million times a year? Keep your hand up. 10 million. A couple hands go down. 100 million times a year. Still? Okay. Good. So we're attacked approximately 540 million times a month, 6 billion times. I say that only to really reinforce the fact that we're big. The attack vectors are really broad. Our surface is large. What's important about this is that we make tons and tons of investments to make sure we're correct 540 million plus times a month, right? Because we all understand that the bad guys only have to be right once. And so that's what makes our job challenging. I'm not sharing the numbers to impress anybody. Maybe a little bit, but just it wasn't meant to, if you're a smaller organization and you don't get attacked this much, count yourself lucky, right? But indirectly, bringing it back to the supply chain conversation, because we drive most of your businesses and organizations, you better be aware of this, right? You better be aware of it, because perhaps one of your larger suppliers, namely Bell, is attacked 540 million times a month. And so you better make sure that we're robust and we're ready. We can't control. The problem with supply chain is our investments focus mainly on control development and technologies, right? There's been a lot of talk around machine learning and AI and how that's going to change the industry. That's largely focused on, security controls to protect the 540 million times that we're attacked a month. It does nothing to address the supply chain risk largely, right? Because it's something that we can't touch and feel. And we keep in mind that some of our largest partners, they themselves are attacked tens or hundreds of millions of times a month, right? So their exposure, their vulnerability becomes our problem. So again, why is managing supply chain so important? I talked about the first one already, so we don't have to go into that one. I would also call out that the prevalence of cloud and SaaS services and the way technology is shifting, I referenced that before. So you're making a connection back to my first comment and all of those old technologies we've forgotten. The rate of change is happening so quickly that we're all pushing more and more into the cloud and relying on SaaS services. This is problematic, not because there isn't value, but it's because it's a threat surface we can't touch and feel, we can't manage in the same way, and we've got to rely really working closely with our partners. I would say bucket number 3, it's a broad bucket, but let's just say this: we're manufacturing, and our supply chain services rely on jurisdictions or countries that look a lot different than ours, both politically, legally, so law enforcement side, all of that makes it more challenging. And many of these geographies, they're ripe with corruption, organized crime, and that becomes a concern for us, because if we're relying on suppliers that operate in those areas, not only are they at risk, but also if there was a problem, sometimes we don't always get the same level of cooperation and coordination. And then finally, the other one that I throw out there is that it's really about regulation, really about policy, and where law in this country is likely to go. Now, some of this is still implied because it hasn't become law yet, but some of what you're reading in C26 and C27, if they're put into practice, we're starting to see legislation that will force tighter supply chain management and recognizing the significant risk to Canada and Canadians. Who remembers these supply chain attacks? What I find interesting about this slide, and I intentionally did pick a variety of supply chain attacks, they touch pretty well in every industry. Chris spoke about it earlier, that cyber problems are cross-sector, and no one is really immune, and this kind of demonstrates it. I'm sure that every organization in here was affected by one of these, and I just grabbed 4, obviously. But it's interesting because I also heard, and I can't remember whether it was Chris or Andrew that spoke earlier and talked about cyber being a human problem. Might have been Chris that mentioned it. That really resonates. It's the way we operate at Bell. A lot of what we do is really focused on this spectrum of human behavior, right? And we think about cyber risk being the accidental, the negligent, or the malicious. And I don't know how many of you that sort of you recognize that or that resonates with you, but supply chain risk is very much the same, right? It's not necessarily the malicious. We have technical controls around those where we can, and we've got to fight, malicious intent and crime as best we can. The accidental, well, we're human. So no matter what we do, we're always going to make the occasional mistake, and we do our best to identify those quickly. What I really focus on internally, as well as in our supply chain, is the negligent, right? Because every company knows better, should do better, but yet they don't, right? And so that's where we tend to focus a bunch of our time. And that's how we think about things in that kind of spectrum. So what I wanted to do was share a little bit of a use case around how Bell tackles this, in the hopes that, sorry, I'm getting a spam call right now, as in fact, that's what you're hearing in the buzz. Yeah, not sure who's listening, but anyway. So I thought it would be helpful to show a bit of a use case on how Bell tackles it, right? So how we target the problem. And we established a framework a couple of years ago when I took over this team, and we started to develop this kind of model because I was particularly concerned about supply chain risk. I'm going to run through it quickly, and I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into one category that I think is relevant. I've heard the question about critical infrastructure a couple of times. So regulated suppliers, which is our tier 1. This is a limited number of companies. We won't go into detail here, but think of this as a category that's reserved for suppliers that are regulated by the government. I'll let you figure out who those are. And we work very, very closely with our federal partners on this category. If you pick up a newspaper over the last couple of years, you'll figure it out. High-risk global suppliers, this is a special category as well. And I show, double X in the companies. I won't give you the number, but this is really any company that we determine poses a national security risk. And we treat them a different way. Namely, we work again with our partners and talk about how we want to approach them. I could tell you more. I'd probably have to kill you. It's a very sensitive area, of course, as you can appreciate. I'll skip over bucket 3 for 1 second because that's the one I want to go into more detail on. Our normal supply chain assurance process. Again, just to give you an idea of the magnitude, 30,000 companies that we operate with, that we deal with. It's growing. Of course, that ranges from the company providing our pencils all the way up to open source support in our cloud transformation. And this is a bit of a standardization process for us. So we rely on open source intelligence tooling. We review, their standard certificates, their ISO compliance, their SOC 1, SOC 2, just like anybody, many of your organizations probably do. We've tightened our annex language over the last few years so that we start moving towards, we pass a lot of that liability on to anybody that we can bully, frankly, any other company that we can force. Some of our largest partners, that's not the way they operate. They're even bigger than us. And so we can't really behave with the same way with them, but we'll talk about them in just a moment. And we're working towards a model that basically makes it impossible to do business with us if you're not going to align with our standards, because the alternative will be you just don't do business with us. So we'll go find alternates, okay? And that means potentially walking away from some suppliers, which we have, which can't demonstrate that they're going to be capable of doing so. But let me go back to tier 3, because this is a special category and a bit of a subset of our approach. And so I want to highlight it. And this has been a big shift for us over the last few years. We always worked on tier 1 with the regulations in place. We always were doing assessments and work on our normal supply chain. We've enhanced some of that, but the big change for us in the last 2 to 3 years has been tier 3. And what we did was we decided to target our 200 most critical, most sensitive, highest risk suppliers and establish a completely different relationship with them, a much higher level of intimacy, I will say. And this is a mixed bag of suppliers. It's not just tech companies. It can include utilities. It can include software, hardware, financial. And the part of the reason for that is because they are critical to our operations. So back to the question that was asked earlier about critical infrastructure. We are very, very aware of our role in critical infrastructure and even what's critical to us as an operator. So what do we do in those ongoing touch points with those suppliers? It's the continued collaboration with them. These are suppliers that we're not going to walk away from. It would actually be impactful and service impactful to our customers if we chose to just walk away because they're not mature enough or they aren't willing to sign off on our contract terms. It's not that easy. And so how do we build collaboration into our model that continues to drag them forward where needed to make sure their products and services we're consuming are secure? And it's the ongoing reviews. And what we started to see is actually that comment at the bottom. We've onboarded, I think, about 80 or 90 of those 200 already into this process. You can imagine it takes a bit of time to get people into this monthly or quarterly touch points. It's a lot of hand-holding. We're actually now seeing our suppliers come forward saying, I want to be there. I want to be in the program. I want it known that I'm in the program and that that Bell is sort of collaborating with me. We call it our Enhanced Supply Chain Assurance Program, ESCAPE. So it has a kind of a fun name. And they now are wanting to be the next one onboarded, right? So it's been an interesting shift. I made this comment before, technology, this is my reference back to that old tech for those 2000 babies, but we're seeing a shift that we've not seen before. The rate of change and how technology is shifting is rapid. It's hard to keep up. Greg earlier spoke about 5G. No one's really talked much about cloud or virtualization. I guess those topics aren't as interesting anymore, but they're major parts of our industry in telecom. It's where we're going. We're heavily virtualized, shifting to cloud first. And so that landscape is constantly changing. And then we touched already on, what legislation could do. So what do I want you to take away? I want you all to take away that you got to understand who your suppliers are. Right? That's first and foremost. If you can't put numbers up on the screen like I just did to know that you have 30,000 suppliers, then you have a problem. So that's something that your organization needs to understand. Know the systems they access or the products and services they're providing for you. It's another fundamental problem. Most of you probably, and I'm putting my hand up, that up to a few years ago, we couldn't even accurately tell you what systems our suppliers were touching. That's a problem, right? You need to understand what's at risk. You got to understand your risk tolerance. You have to know what you're comfortable with and what you're not. And that's an important question to ask within your companies or within your organizations. And I would say become intimate with your suppliers because the bumper at the bottom, managing supply chain risk doesn't end with a purchase, which is really how we've largely managed or dealt with supply chain security, up until probably just even a few years ago, right? It's an ongoing, constant battle. Now, some of you might say this is fine for a big company. I told you we bully smaller companies into compliance. Sometimes we do. And that might be true that not all of you would be able to go back into your own organizations and implement something like this. That's true. But what I would say is at least understand the first three, right? Your suppliers may not want to be more intimate. If you were to come to me at Bell Canada and you were to say, I want Rod in a room every month, you better be a pretty big company to make me do that. And I'm being fair. That's just the reality. I can't spread around to every single organization in this audience, right? So some of you may not have the benefit of that, but understand who your suppliers are, what they access, and what you're comfortable with. So you can start to drive decision-making in your organization. And then rely on large organizations like us to help lift the entire landscape. The more we push suppliers together, right? The largest suppliers globally that are still perpetuating and developing terrible code, right? As an example, the more we push them, it's better for all, right? So the more we can align on a framework or models like this, and it's going to be ongoing, it's going to be constant. This is not a single event or point in time. With that, I'll pause. I got the 5-minute flag, and I'll stop in case there's any questions, but thank you very much.
Great presentation. Hi, Laura Oblinas with the New Brunswick Cybersecurity Ecosystem again. So question for you on the regulatory framework. If we look at other innovation ecosystems, I'm going to use Germany as an example, advanced manufacturing, they're global leaders in advanced manufacturing, primarily and really started from government policies in terms of having requirements for innovation and process improvement. So from the Canadian context, how do we shift the focus in Canada of, Bell's got a great example in the work that you're doing, but as you mentioned, it's super high touch. You're working with all the suppliers. There is a need to sort of standardize and have some sort of a baseline standardization across the country for all businesses to be cyber secure. So we shift from the reaction and the reactive risk management to being proactive and cyber ready. What do you believe from your perspective is the role of both government and industry in helping to accelerate that process so that we can make sure that that uptake happens? Because there has been numerous attempts to be able to get that happening in Canada, and we're not there yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it comes on the heels of the public consult and input into the cyber strategy too. And I'll share that this is an area that we disclose, we think is an important initiative, and it needs to be part of our national cyber strategy. I think the role for government is, there's a role to be played there around standardization of a framework. So we all have a common baseline to start from. I think that's important. I do think though that it'll take private sector largely to drive. I mean, imagine if we had a model that allowed a consortium of companies to act as a clearinghouse, right? So that you understood what my framework looked like, the diligence we applied, and you could trust, right? That that you could allow that company to, or that supplier to be your supplier because you knew that Bell was diligent and had already established a framework with them. Right. That would be powerful because you'd be able to draw on some of the scale that we have. I mean, my team alone is over 100. That's not all of our security professionals in the company, right? That's just on the governance and assurance and compliance side. And some of the smaller organizations, the more you can depend on that scale, I think that's going to be important, right? And that's really more about the communal kind of response to protect Canadians.
Great, thanks.
Sure, go ahead.
So just looking at your key messages, the first three of them seem to be creating a map of the supply chain and what the risks are. It seems like there might be a next step of how do you ensure resilience if all of that map breaks, or how do you detect that the map is broken? Right. That weren't in your key messages, and I was wondering if you had anything to add to that.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think there was elements that I'm not going to go into great detail around what we do in our detection and response capabilities, but I also think that's going to depend on you as an organization as well, right? There's going to be a variety of models, depending on your operational model, depending on the scale of your organization. I think part of what I didn't share here is, we just call them controls, but our comprehensive list of controls that apply to a supplier, any supplier, how we choose to kind of hold them accountable, or how we is a different discussion. It's a risk-based discussion, but that's going to come along with 30 or 35 controls that we demand of every supplier, and it's everyone gets the basic. Everyone is probably publishing their list of questionnaires and surveys. Of course we do that, and then we take it to kind of a different level. So what I didn't talk about was the mapping of how you think about security. You need to understand that, but frankly that should be part of your management system anyway. Over and above supply chain, you should understand. If you don't, that's another, that your organization needs to take some time to reflect on it and figure out. There's many good standards out there if you don't have to invent one yourself.
Yes, thank you, Rod, for the presentation and also the explanation on the systems that you have put in place to monitor your supply chain. Now, someone spoke about complexity this morning. Is there a limit to what you can do? Because it's exponential.
Yeah.
Your supply chain providers have their own supply chain providers and so on and so forth. So where do you put the limit? How do you handle that? Because I'm very curious about that aspect.
Yeah, so there's limits on a couple of fronts. One, you notice that I said 200 suppliers. That's where we've got to tap out, even for an organization of our size. It's a lot of handholding. And so the way we view it is eventually some suppliers will graduate, if you will, and they'll come through the program. We're comfortable and we don't need to have that high touch with them anymore. And maybe we'll just circle back about at contract renewals or when there's something important happening. So that's on our side. I think when it comes to third, fourth, fifth party supply chain risk, that's where we end up probably deferring or passing risk on to them as a supplier. That's why the contract language is so important. We push and we expect our suppliers to have a management system that looks as good or better than ours. And as part of that, that means they have the appropriate processes and models in place to manage their own suppliers. And they should know those questions of who those suppliers are, what they're accessing, and then again, how they should be protecting. So our limit, we're going to be monitoring for anything that impacts our systems, impacts our direct relationship. But to the extent that it goes down to third, fourth, fifth party suppliers of our own third party, we're not going to be doing any direct monitoring. We're going to be relying on our partner to be doing that on our behalf because they would have already demonstrated to us that they have the appropriate controls and processes in place. Does that help? Yeah.